Well, hello everyone. We're live, it seems, this morning from Australia. Welcome to everyone tuning in from all around the world. This is our fourth session of the Buddha-Dhamma series. So we'll just wait a few moments for people to connect in and catch up with each other. Nice to see all the familiar faces, for want of a better word, familiar people dropping in from different parts of the world. I hope you're all doing well. So today in our Buddha-Dhamma series, well, actually before we begin, just a little message, and I'll try to remember to mention it again at the end of our session. But just to mention that usually we do something every 2 weeks, a live session, but in the next 2 weeks, where both Samaneri Jayasara and I will be in retreat, so we won't be able to do that session, so we'll just cancel that. And the following 2 weeks, it'll be Samaneri Jayasara guiding this session, guiding the meditation and Q&A session. So I'll try and remember that again. And of course, the dates of the next session will be displayed on our website with the links just a couple of days after each session. Okay. Lovely. People from different parts of the States, different parts of Europe and Australia. Where else have we got? Someone dropping in from Japan. That's great. Well, I can't really say anymore, can I, that the UK is Europe, or can I? I guess it is. But let's say people dropping in from Europe and the UK, England, Wales, Scotland. Fantastic. Hi, Wendy from Sydney. Well, we'll make a start. There's always a bit of a delay with the messages coming through the chat. Lots of people still saying hi, dropping in, a few people from Holland. Great. So, as in the previous couple of sessions, I'm going to start with the talk and then take that theme into a guided meditation before the Q&A. And today we're going to discuss more specifically around mindfulness and meditation in the early Buddhist tradition. Even though that hasn't been separate from what we've discussed so far, to do a series on early Buddhism or the fundamental paradigms of the Buddhist teaching, to not focus on particularly mindfulness and meditation paradigms would be a great omission. But I want to tie it into this fundamental nutshell that we've been unpacking, which is the Four Noble Truths, really the understanding of which is considered right view, or the view that leads to liberation, or that reveals the truth. So as we do that today, as we work through this, I'm going to sum up a little bit where we've come from in the first 3 sessions, to arrive here today. And I'm going to bring a few paradigms within this session. So not only mindfulness, there's different ways of meditation as well. And perhaps specifically focus a bit on what's called the 5 hindrances, which are usually what we deal with a lot when we start to cultivate a meditation practice. The 5 hindrances and their counterpart, the 7 factors of enlightenment. So, just a reminder before I begin this talk, I'm going to ask people, it's great to see people dropping in and saying hi, but I'm going to ask you to refrain from making comments and using the chat box while we move through this Dharma talk. And that way you can stay focused on what I'm saying. And if any questions are arising in your mind as I talk, quite often you'll find they're answered a little further down along within the talk itself, or otherwise just make a note of it yourself if you want to ask it in the Q&A, and kind of hold that until Q&A comes, and just helps the whole group to stay focused. I really appreciate that. Okay. So in the Buddha's teaching, some of you, it's hard for me to know how many of you are beginners in the practice, or obviously I know some people, some are very experienced in the practice and in Buddhist meditation particularly. Others are more new to Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. But I'm going to just speak generally with some specifics so I can communicate to all of you in the best way I can. I will try not to get bogged down in particulars, because when we talk about mindfulness meditation, and particularly the way the Buddha taught the 4 foundations of mindfulness, it can get quite particular and specific, which is great. And I will gloss most of that territory, but I won't get bogged down in specifics. But I want to make a few points, good points about meditation in general. So in the Buddhist tradition, if you recall from the first session, we talked about the 4 Noble Truths as the nutshell, talked about as the elephant's footprint, analogous to the elephant's footprint, being the largest footprint of all the animals in the forest. All other animals of the forest's footprints can fit within the elephant's. And so the 4 Noble Truths are described in the same way. Everything the Buddha taught, all the pointers he made about liberation, about understanding the way to freedom from suffering, can all be fit into and are contained within these 4 Noble Truths. So you'll remember that the Buddha's teaching, and within that time in India, over 2,500 years ago, spiritual teachings weren't written down. They were remembered. They were recollected. They were considered sacred enough to not put into writing, but to be imbibed and remembered and studied within, to see the truth of them. And in spiritual traditions of those times, then you'll find a certain way of teaching, paradigmatic ways of teaching, that are used to help recollect and unpack the details of the teaching. So you get these overarching paradigms presented. The details are within. And once you start unpacking it, there are many details within, but you have this overall sense of this nutshell of the 4 Noble Truths. Everything that the Buddha taught is within that. So this includes about the practice of meditation and where it fits within the path to liberation. So you'll recall the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth noble truth, the path, the way of being, the way of practicing, that allows, that develops the qualities of mind that lead to the shedding or the allaying of confusion, of delusion, of greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed, hatred, delusion are considered not only the roots of the unwholesome, but the things within our mind stream, habitual reactivity within our mind stream that keeps the mind confused and bound to cycles of suffering or samsaric suffering. And through the dispelling of greed, hatred, and delusion, the clarity that emerges and the understanding that emerges allows the seeing of truth, or the way things are, which is liberating in itself. So the Buddha's teachings was always about clearing away the stuff, the dust that gets kicked up in order to see reality as it is. He's not teaching us to, put on a new filter to see things in this way or see things in that way and gloss over the reality, but to see reality as it is, free of delusion, free of confusion, free of distortion, and that truth liberates in and of itself. So that means that truth that he's pointing to is here and now, and he makes that very clear in his early teachings. And the place of practice is here and now, in this very body and mind where we experience suffering in all its simplicity and complexity, in its mundanity. We're talking about just the little annoyances of everyday life, as much as the major, the more impactful mind states that bring suffering to a being, physically, mentally, or emotionally. So within this path of practice the Buddha is recommending, we're talking about not just developing the mind, actually, but we're really also looking at and studying cause and effect through the very actions of body, speech, and mind, action and result. This is an important part of Buddhist practice, because in the West we can get very overly focused on meditation and even on the practice of mindfulness itself as a meditation technique. Whereas actually mindfulness is a mental factor, the Buddha pointed out, that actually needs to be developed in the whole of our life, in everything that we do. So just to point out these, I think I have mentioned them before, what the Buddha calls the 5 spiritual faculties, starting with faith or confidence, energy or the ability to apply based on that confidence of some understanding. It arouses energy to apply yourself in a particular way. And mindfulness as a third spiritual faculty. Then samadhi. Some people think samadhi is just about a deep state of concentration attained in meditation. But samadhi is pointed out as a spiritual faculty. It's not we can use it to describe a deep state of concentration, but it's also a mental faculty that we all have. We wouldn't be able to function in our daily life without it. The fact that you can concentrate enough or bring the mind to focus enough to hear what I'm saying and to stay with it long enough to comprehend what I'm saying. There is mindfulness and samadhi, the faculties of mindfulness and samadhi working there. The fifth spiritual faculty is wisdom, or another panya, that is the Pali word. We can also call that understanding. It's understanding the way things work. And in the Buddha's way of teaching panya or wisdom, or pointing to it, or encouraging the development of it, it's especially in regard to the truth of the way things are. So seeing through illusion, delusion, the projections of confusion, to just see things as they are. And this kind of wisdom, this kind of understanding, which also understands cause and effect, the way that works in the mind, this is considered wisdom because it's liberating. So these 5 spiritual faculties, faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, we all have them. Whether you consider yourself spiritual or not, as human beings, we have these mental faculties in some measure. We wouldn't be able to function without them. But here the Buddha's identifying them as spiritual faculties. They enhance spiritual understanding, spiritual meaning, the territory through engaging with or developing particular faculties and understanding in a particular way brings us to the truth, to understanding the truth, which is the fruit of a spiritual life, that transcendent reality, the true nature of the mind or of being, which in and of itself is liberating from the experience of suffering. So these spiritual faculties, he said, by the full development of these, it is through the power of those, they become spiritual powers. These very same faculties become spiritual powers and lead one, bring one out to full understanding and liberation. They work together. So mindfulness is that central faculty. Now then he went on to teach ways of practicing mindfulness. And it was about bringing mindfulness to every aspect of our life, every aspect of our experience. In fact, there is some degree of mindfulness within every aspect of our experience wherein we're attentive to something. But then to develop that mindfulness is to bring more and more awareness in a particular way, to recognize what's happening in the mind in this moment, or recognize what is motivating this mind to action, to speech, or motivating this mind in terms of the way it's thinking. The way we think then leads to action and speech. The way we think, in fact, habitual or otherwise, is at the root of whether we experience suffering or not. So being able to bring mindfulness to these movements of mind, what does that do? It brings in some space. It brings in the ability to reflect on what's happening. It brings in that not only the space for reflection, but the space for seeing in particular the characteristics of what we're observing, of what we're now aware of. And in the last session of Buddha-Dhamma, we talk specifically about the 3 characteristics of conditioned phenomena to be observed in order for insight leading to release to arise. So I'll just point those out again, and this is particularly what we're beginning to observe with the power of mindfulness. Not only bringing into view what's actually happening in this moment in terms of the experience of sense impression, experience through the 6 senses, or experience in terms of the 5 khandhas, bodily experience, feeling of pleasure or pain, or neutrality, perception, mental labels, memory, mental formations, thoughts, ideas, concepts, anything that arises in the mind with volition, with will, with movement, we can class as a mental formation. And sense consciousness, that 5th khandha. These 5 khandhas embrace the whole of our experience of bodily, mental experience. So this is the territory that we're observing. And it is the stuff that is appearing here and now, moment by moment. So this is the context of our practice. It's the very context of our life, in fact. But it is also, in terms of the Buddha's teaching, the context of our practice, the 5 khandhas. When we're cultivating, the Buddha's encouraging the cultivation of mindfulness, the faculty of mindfulness, to bring awareness to these processes. These khandhas, these 5 khandhas, without much experience, you'll tend to conceive of them as fixed things, this body as a fixed thing, this mind and its various processes as kind of fixed things that we observe. But as we begin to observe them with the power of mindfulness and developing samadhi, the power of the faculty of samadhi, which helps to sustain awareness, we start to see the reality that these khandhas are ever changing, moment by moment. This body-mind is arising, ceasing, and interacting, morphing, as we observe in a more focused way, i.e. more mindfulness, more presence of mind, more samadhi. As we develop that capacity, we're observing these khandhas just as they are. This is the territory of the practice, and the Buddha made it quite clear that this is where suffering arises and where suffering ceases. Nowhere else. Suffering doesn't cease. In 2 weeks' time or 10 years' time, it's possible to see cessation of suffering here and now. If our attention, our mindfulness, our samadhi is, let's say, pointed in the right direction, which is just with what is appearing in this moment. So this then is the territory of meditation. The Buddha talked quite often more in terms of bhavana. So bhavana is the Pali word that is translated as mental cultivation or mental development or mind development. And it actually encompasses a wide variety of what we call practices, or the development of a wide body of faculties and skills that bring the mind to development. Development being increase perhaps all these 5 faculties, 5 spiritual faculties, but particularly increase the understanding, the clarity, the skill of being able to calm the body and mind, or allow the body and mind to rest in calm. The skill of being able to see through or recognize the various expressions of greed, hatred, and delusion, whether we call them kilesa or fetters or hindrances, but also to see around them, to recognize them to the point is where we can eventually not get caught in them or by them, not get hooked in them, hooked in a push-pull relationship, but just allow them to cease. So this is all the territory of mental cultivation, which includes the cultivation of the four, what we call the four Brahma Viharas: kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity. These can be cultivated as practices, but they're also, in some ways, in many ways, they are the results of insight, the results of the insight that frees the heart in certain measures of greed, hatred, and delusion, such that the true nature of the heart, which is loving, which is compassionate, shines through more and more. And the equanimity is a result of understanding, particularly of karma and the way things are, the way things work, allows the heart to rest in equanimity. So in some way, all of these things we can see as results of a path of practice, and yet they can all be cultivated as skills, as qualities of mind. So with mindfulness, as I said, it's encouraged for us to bring this faculty of mindfulness into every aspect of our life. So how is mindfulness defined? You know, I should say that even today, certain scholars and practitioners still debate how to define this word sati appropriately. You know, so it's not been completely settled on in terms of the definition that should define sati. It's quite hard to get your finger on it and say it's that. So we talk about it, and yet it's described as a way of practice. But how to sum it up as a definition is still somewhat elusive, and different practitioners, scholars will lean to different ways of describing that. So we can say in general that mindfulness is about being able to be present, to bring presence, to bring attentive awareness to the moment, to this moment, to what's happening here and now. And some people will add to observe without judgment. Some people don't like that because they think they will say that mindfulness is actually about discerning what's wholesome and unwholesome. That's really lies with the factor of wisdom working together with mindfulness. Wholesome, unwholesome. It's an understanding of the factors, the mind states that are arising, to know, are they leading in the direction of suffering for oneself or another? Are they already expressive and demonstrative of suffering here and now for oneself or another? Or not? Are they leading in the direction of benefit for oneself or another, and already demonstrating the benefit here and now for oneself or others? This is the difference between skillful, unskillful, wholesome or unwholesome mind states. So this comes about through understanding. But there's no understanding arising without mindfulness, without seeing, being present enough for the mind, the wisdom factor to comprehend what is what. Sorry about those background noises. That's Caddy having some breakfast. She shares this room too. So she's making lots of slurping noises. And because she's deaf, I can't tell her off to be quiet. So we have loving kindness for Caddy as she enjoys, and sympathetic joy as she enjoys her breakfast. Okay, so when we talk about mindfulness, many people know the teaching of the Buddha as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And in fact, right mindfulness, the 7th factor of the Eightfold Path, is defined as the 4 foundations of mindfulness, or some translations are the 4 placements of mindfulness, or the 4 frames of reference. These are really the domains of experience wherein the Buddha is encouraging us to develop our mindfulness, to really bring the power of mindfulness to reflect upon these 4 domains of experience, because that's the most fruitful for liberating insight to arise. So these 4 domains are firstly the body, mindfulness of body. Second is mindfulness of feeling. The third is mindfulness of mind states, or just mindfulness of mind. The fourth is mindfulness of Dhamma. And people translate this in different ways. It could be mindfulness of phenomena. Some call it mindfulness of mind objects. It's really, that domain is scooping up a lot of the different paradigms of the Buddha to be mindful of, such as be mindful of and come to understand the 5 hindrances, the 5 khandhas, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. So we can say this is mindfulness of phenomena as it unfolds in terms of Dhamma, the Buddha-Dhamma, the liberating teaching. And we'll come back to that 4th foundation a little bit later on. So this practice of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, or as it gets presented, it's in, let me just say that any of you can read this discourse. This is in one of the most popular translations is Bhikkhu Bodhi, the middle length discourses of the Buddha. It's Sutta number 10 in that collection of the Majjhima Nikaya. And you can find translations online, Sutta Central or Access to Insight with Ajahn Thanissara's translations. Excuse me. So it's easy to find these texts and have a read of them because, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of detail in there. But because it's essentially a recitation, there's a lot of repetition and formality within the structure of the discourse, which can sometimes be off-putting for people and many people feel that they can't really relate to that kind of way of teaching or the way the teaching's presented. But there's lots of detail within that. And these teachings, as I was saying, are originally meant for people to take away and to contemplate, to unpack in a contemplative mode, not just to study. They would study to remember it so they could go into seclusion and practice with whatever was arising, and then take pointers from the details of this teaching in order to direct their practice and understanding, unlock the understanding. So it's a very comprehensive discourse. So everything about this first foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of the body, there's There's 6 different significant practices within that. So mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the 4 postures, sitting, standing, walking, lying down, mindfulness of everything we do in the day, as mundane as using the toilet, eating, drinking, walking forward, going here, going there, speaking, etc. A contemplation of the internal organs, what we call the 32 parts of the body, starting with hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin, going through blood, marrow, bone, really using this as a contemplative device to get a sense of what the body is made up of on that level, which is a kind of the apparent level. And then you've got the contemplation of the 4 elements, which is going much more deeply into what makes up the direct experience of form, which is the 4 elements, the earth, water, fire, air element. And then you've got the traditional contemplations, which expand to about 9 different contemplations in the cemetery. Contemplations where the summoners of the Buddha's day would go to the cemetery to actually observe a corpse and observe the corpses in various stages of decay over the course of time, and to reflect more directly that just as this corpse is decaying in this way, so this body is of the same nature. So you can see the different types of practices that come under the umbrella of the foundation of mindfulness, which is contemplating the body as the body. Many different practices within that, but they're all geared to recognize the true nature of the body as it is subject to decay, subject to illness, decay, aging, death. This is at the manifest level, but then looking into our very experience of the body here and now, looking into the elements themselves and the experience of respiration, in and out breathing. These practices can, all of them, they're actually developing mindfulness, bringing mindfulness to reflect on the way things are, to recognize anicca, change, dukkha, in the fact of its unsatisfactory nature, being that change can never bring lasting happiness. Even when there's pleasure produced by the body, that pleasant experience is in a process of change. It can't stay. It's morphing. But more importantly, the fact that this body is not self, not me, not mine. There is that which knows the arising and ceasing of these different factors of what we call body. Now, this level of insight can only be tasted directly through the application of mindfulness, through the development of the mind that rests, that can bring these different aspects of experience, direct experience in the moment, bring them into focus, rest one's attention, and insight is a natural occurrence when these spiritual faculties work together, come together. Now, all of these practices of mindfulness, body, feeling, mind states, and phenomena, in the way we're encouraged to practice mindfulness meditation, they all develop calm and insight. The particular insight that goes throughout the whole teaching of mindfulness is to recognize the arising factors and the ceasing factors. factors, to recognize these experience of body or form, or the elements, the breath, feeling tone, mind states, phenomena. They're all in a process of rising and ceasing, rising and ceasing. When the mind sees that clearly with wisdom, clinging is allayed, clinging is naturally abandoned. So it's about seeing it clearly with wisdom, which often takes quite a while of observing these things and bringing these, allowing these spiritual faculties to come to a degree of potency, such that the mind is no longer hindered by distraction, by selfing processes. I am this, I am that, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. The push-pull of memory, volition, all habitual reactive processes. When the mind settles through mindfulness and samadhi, those hindrances, those 5 hindrances that I'll talk more about, thin out and drop away. So the clarity emerges. It's not that it's a thing that's developed, but it's like the cloudiness in turbid water. When the wind stops blowing, the mud settles and the water naturally becomes clear. And anyone with good eyesight can see the environment reflected in that water and see through to what's within that water. That's the direct analogy for what happens. And that clear seeing releases the mind from the delusion of selfing. The mind that says, this is me, this is mine, this is myself. I've got to do this to get there. I've got to do this to push away that, to get rid of this. This is just putting words to what the mind is habitually engaged in a push-pull relationship with so much of our experience. So just coming to the foundation of mindfulness on feeling, the second foundation, the encouragement is just to recognize feeling tone, physically or mentally. We can cultivate that practice. The last session of the Buddha-Dhamma series, I talk specifically about what this khandha of feeling tone is. It's that affective tone of either pleasure or pleasantness or unpleasantness, or in the middle where it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but it can lean subtly to pleasant or unpleasant. Every moment actually of our experience, there is a valence of, we can experience this valence of something pleasant or unpleasant. So the Buddha's encouraging us to get to know that, because that's usually the territory where we're caught in the push-pull. We're so conditioned we want to keep the pleasant, quite naturally, move away from or get rid of the unpleasant. And it keeps the mind and the body in a fairly constant state of movement, agitation. So we're not trying to destroy that process. We're actually wanting to come to see it, to understand it. So it's not as if suddenly you've got to like the unpleasant and be completely, unreactive to the pleasant. We want to just bring our mindfulness to that process. Bring our awareness to, what is this feeling tone? Like just now, the sound of the birds. To me, that's mostly pleasant. If 10 flocks of cockatoos came to land on the deck and were screeching, it would become unpleasant, I would imagine. Very loud. just to notice how that is. We're not making any judgments about that. Just, yes. And when that unpleasant valence or feeling tone becomes apparent in the mind stream, just notice what happens there. What mind states does it give rise to? This feeling tone of unpleasantness. We want to shut down, we tighten the body-mind, or we start scheming of how to get away or get rid of. Just to notice in our meditation what's going on, to notice what feelings of pleasantness appear, and to notice what happens in the mind. To notice this quality of identification and clinging as it arises. Because in the way of the Buddha's teaching on dependent origination is that feeling tone is what gives rise to tanha, craving. And craving is at the root of the production of suffering, tanha. Craving is one translation, the most common translation. More literally, it means thirst. So it's like it turns the mind, it creates within the mind a need, a thirst, usually unconsciously, to keep something pleasant, to get rid of something unpleasant. It creates a sense first of the clinging, the I am this is me. I want it or I don't want it. So feeling tone is so important, so primary to understand and to get to know how it arises and ceases, because feeling tone is the primary condition for the arising of craving. And yet, when feeling tone ceases, as it does, because it's only ever momentary, craving ceases as well in the moment, unless where we have no awareness of it, no mindfulness of it. Confusion continues to reign if there's no recognition of the arising and ceasing and the intimate connection of those factors. Craving can only arise upon feeling tone. Feeling tone arises and ceases like all the other khandhas. Craving arises and ceases depending on feeling tone. Feeling tone can only arise with sense contact. It can only arise in 6 places, in 6 ways, through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or thinking, knowing at the mind door, knowing a particular idea or thought or concept, or eschewing meaning from any of the 5 sense data interpreted through mind. So with sense contact, only with sense contact does feeling tone arise. Only with feeling tone does craving arise. But if your mindfulness is present to recognize the momentariness of sense contact, the momentariness of feeling tone, one can also see the momentariness of craving. If they cease, if in full awareness wisdom discerns their cessation in the moment, clinging cannot arise, suffering cannot arise. In that moment. So you can see how important it is to cultivate these qualities of mindfulness, awareness, concentration, or samadhi, which is, I'll talk a bit more about that, and wisdom, to bear upon these momentary arising factors as we recognize them within our experience, and to sustain awareness there, which is samadhi, enough to recognize cessation, causal factors, When this arises, that arises. When that ceases, this ceases. This is the territory of insight around the Paticca Samuppada, which is the territory of that second and third noble truth on arising and ceasing. So the third foundation of mindfulness, just to gloss the territory it covers, is around mind states. Most particularly to recognize, to learn to recognize when the mind is affected by greed, hatred, delusion, and when it's not affected by those things. Excuse me. So to recognize the mind. So we can usually recognize, well, let's hope we can at least practice to start to recognize when anger is present. So this third foundation of mindfulness practice is about recognizing in that moment, oh yeah, the mind is affected by dosa. That's the Pali Sanskrit word for the root of anger, which gets translated as hatred or ill. Hatred, yeah, for the most part. It's the root of anger, ill will, aversion. So any of these qualities of within our mind, even just when we start to get a little bit irritated, that slight irritation and aversion that arises. So, oh yeah, so here we can see the mind is now affected by aversion or ill will. And if we don't see it, it may grow into anger, or it may grow into anger anyway, even as we're observing it, if it's a particularly powerful trigger. So we keep observing and recognize the mind is now affected by hatred. As we observe that with mindfulness, it actually, that mindfulness, as I said earlier, injects the space so as we don't immediately go from this disturbing emotion of anger to lashing out through action or speech in the situation, where our mindfulness, our concentration is sufficient to be able to observe and to inquire, that's interesting. How did that arise? What are the arising factors, the factors that gave rise to this? Once again, it can only come through sense contact. Was it a feeling tone in the body? Was it that knee, that twinge of pain in the knee? A moment of contact at the body, at the physical door. Without seeing that clearly, the mind can give rise to aversion. But seeing it clearly, it doesn't have to give rise to aversion. It just recognizes, painful feeling. And wisdom assesses, do I need to move the body or not? Mindfully, with right view. That is understanding how these factors arise. But the interesting thing in this third foundation of mindfulness as well, we're not told to get rid of anything. We're told to observe when the mind is affected by greed or lust. Lobha is the Pali Sanskrit word. And affected by lust, hatred, or delusion, just to notice when that is so. And start to notice the causal factors for its arising and its ceasing. And to also notice when the mind is not affected. So if something ceases, the mind is no longer affected by aversion. We notice that. And there's various other permutations of mind states within that frame that it refers to. It's just about noticing what's present, embracing it with mindfulness, noticing the arising and ceasing factors, or the arising and vanishing factors in regard to them. And the fourth foundation, as I mentioned earlier, is about these 5 paradigmatic views of Dhamma, to observe them as phenomena. And in a way, these 5 things, the 5 hindrances, the 5 khandhas, upadana khandha, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. This is the territory of insight. And in a way, even though scholars these days, and particularly Venerable Analayo, is doing some deep research into comparative studies of suttas across the traditions, the Pali tradition, the Chinese tradition, and starting to identify later stratas and earlier stratas of the canon, the Pali canon, or the teachings of the Buddha across the Chinese and Pali versions. So we can't always say that some of these things weren't added later, because it seems in particular in this 4th foundation that we know for sure the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of enlightenment are common amongst all the different available texts we have of these early teachings. And then the other 3 are sometimes included and sometimes not included, 1, 2, or 3 of them. So we know for sure this 4th foundation brings to mind and suggests, encourages us to get to know and to study the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of enlightenment. So these are really primary. But even if these other 3 were added slightly later, to me they make a very comprehensive view of the territory that the mind moves through in terms of insight. To get to know, after, as well as the 5 hindrances, the 5 khandhas and the 6 sense bases. You can see, as I was referring to them, this is the territory, the very context of our practice and our insight. Without a full understanding of how the 6 senses work through direct knowing, direct witnessing, and what the 5 khandhas are, how they manifest and disappear, we don't get through the territory of full understanding. It remains conceptual. And lastly, the 4 noble truths, they're the insights that arise with this full understanding. And so this list of 5 is a real complete, comprehensive, how shall we say, brushstroke. It's like a brushstroke of the progress of insight, and the territory of insight that one moves through and that one develops one's mindfulness with, in order for this liberating insight into the 4 noble truths to fruit completely. So just to go a little bit into more detail about these 5 hindrances, they're called nivarana, because this is what we encounter in our meditation practice, whether we're beginners, middling practitioners, or very experienced practitioners. We have to come to know what these 5 hindrances are in order to see around them, to not be obstructed by them, and ultimately they are allayed by the power of mindfulness and concentration, working together with wisdom, that is, understanding what they are, how they arise, how they cease. Now you'll all recognize these hindrances. It's sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, what gets called sloth and torpor, dullness and laziness is another way to translate. Restlessness and worry in the mind, and skeptical doubt. So these 5 things, these 5 mind states are what get knocked out of play when the mind reaches a state of unification or samadhi. It doesn't have to be as deep as a full-on jhana, but even just to the point of unification that is not yet in full jhana, these 5 hindrances are knocked out of play for a time. And it's talked about that after jhana, after someone has dwelled in a concentrative state, a unification of mind, these 5 hindrances can be knocked out of play relative to how long the mind stays in this place, which is quite pure, quite free of these hindrances. And so even after emerging from that and then going on with your daily life, these 5 hindrances can remain suppressed for a time. It's almost like the karmic result of that dwelling in the purity of mind, or dwelling without them for a while. They stay suppressed, but they creep back in. Now, this is interesting territory because some people might think they've attained some degree of awakening because they're, after some deep concentration, they're like, their mind feels really pure and free of these hindrances. It's a great time for insight, but it's also a potential time for delusion. And this is sometimes referred to within the texts, or mostly commentarial texts, is that the mind can be deluded by these wholesome qualities, these wholesome states. We can be deluded into thinking we're done and dusted, or we've attained something. And these hindrances can creep back in, and before you know it, you might be thinking, oh, I'm done with anger, I'm done with ill will. And then suddenly, or gradually, it emerges in some kind of shadowy way. So one has to be very careful, but also to know that the effect of deep concentrative practice is a suppression of the 5 hindrances, and has its tremendous benefits for insight practice and for really continuing the practice of mindfulness to gain insight, because there's freedom from the hindrances. But be careful about how you conceive of that in terms of I, me, and mine. Now, coming back to getting to know these hindrances, any of us, and as we'll notice, we'll do an exploration in the meditation around this. How to recognize sensual desires, just those little desires in meditation. Oh, what am I going to have for dinner? I'd like to go here, go there. The little, oh, that's nice, this is nice, oh, I don't like that. The little movements of desire and aversion that we see, it's the momentum of the conditioned mind. So we want to get to know it. We don't want to, oh, I have to get rid of that and I have to get rid of this. Well, this isn't good, I'm such a bad person. All of that's actually still the play of desire and aversion. We just want to get to see it, to become familiar with the characteristics of sensual desire is obvious in terms of the desire for something pleasant through sight, sound, smell, taste, tactile sensation, or even a pleasant idea, a pleasant thought to dwell in. The desire for that is we call sensual desire. Ill will, any kind of aversion arising in regard to sense experience. dullness we can recognize as meditation practitioners oftentimes at some point in our meditation, we start to see ourselves drifting into sleep or just zoning out or waking up to the fact, I don't know where I've been in the last 10 minutes in terms of you've lost mindful awareness. Not that awareness has gone away, but some kind of cloudy fog has descended and there wasn't the clarity of awareness. Restlessness and worry, so obviously. Restlessness of the body is one thing, but also restlessness of the mind. Our minds are stimulated so much these days that inevitably, when we sit down to meditate, there's this momentum of what we just saw on the internet, the last conversation we had, the things I need to do, the things I've just done. The mind's moving. We just need to know, this is the restlessness of the mind. Notice here that we're not saying, this is bad, I've got to get rid of this. We're not developing ill will towards restlessness. Just saying, this is what restlessness feels like. Identifying it. This is mental restlessness. Yes. What does it feel like? How does it behave? How do I get caught in reacting to it? Wanting, not wanting, push, pull. How can I relate to this in a way that allows it to ease out? So this is all the territory of inquiry, where we use the power of mindfulness and wisdom. Worry, the other counterpart of that hindrance, restlessness and worry. We all know what that looks and feels like, but usually we're not engaged in a mindful understanding of it. Often we're just caught in the story. We're caught in the flavor of worry, moving in cycles and circles with it. So when we start to recognize, this is the mind state of worry, now we've got some space and reflection. That's what it is. And so we're just observing it as a phenomena. When you can observe it as phenomena, it's already, you can see with clarity, it's not me, not mine. It's a karmically arisen habitual state. But as soon as we have mindfulness and awareness, some understanding of its changing nature, the not self nature, if we identify with it, move with it, it's immediately felt to be dukkha. The experience of it has a degree of dukkha in its changing, agitated character. We can observe that. Once our understanding ripens more fully, we have the experience of the fact that it's not self, and as that occurs, it drops away. Sometimes just with the removal of a certain perception that brings rise to worry, or its ceasing, worry ceases. And seeing that is so important with wisdom, with discernment. So skeptical doubt, I'll say a little more about, and then we'll go to the meditation. Skeptical doubt is the doubt was we're not really sure about what we're trying to do here, about what the fruit of this is. We haven't really yet seen with insight the truth of the Dhamma. And so the mind can still move somewhat. Not really sure about this, not really sure about that. Doubt can be set up in other ways as well, just the doubting nature of the mind when it sets up a polarized version of a choice. I could either choose to do this or that, and then we flip-flop between the two, which is a very painful state, actually. So getting to know the way doubt manifests in the mind, that uncertainty, that irresolution, not sure, keeps the mind moving, doesn't let it settle, or a polarized choice that gets set up. Just notice it as a mind state. It is something that infiltrates. It's not something that is innate to the mind. It's not like even though we often conceive this, I am such a doubter, you know. Sometimes our characters, our personalities tend to have more of one hindrance or another, but we shouldn't let it define us. We shouldn't identify with it to the point where I am this. That's exactly what we're wanting to see through. So we just get to know when a hindrance is present. This is what it feels like. This is how it behaves. This is what it is. So we've got that perspective with mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. We're getting to know it. We get to know it so well, particularly in its characteristics of changeability. It's always in a process of flux and change. Anicca, dukkha, and anatta. It's not self. There's that which observes and knows, and then when it ceases, wisdom, the mind knows with clarity. It ceases. It's impermanent. It's not self. Not who and what I am. And we can even use this phrase. The Buddha encourages us to reflect around all these different expressions of the khandhas and experiences of the sense bases, to reflect, that this is not me, this is not mine, it's not what I am. Not to suppress or push them away, but it's like a reminder that, oh yeah, this is a mind state, it's arisen. It'll soon cease. I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to take ownership of it. Just reminding ourselves of that can give us a certain perspective and way of being with this experience that allows these things to ease out much sooner than they otherwise would. So I've talked for quite a while now, and I apologize for going on, but I think I've arrived at a sufficient coverage of that territory of mindfulness. Very hard to fit it all into a brief session. But let's now move into a guided meditation, and I will try to just pick up on some of these experiences of the hindrances, just to give you a sense of, to help you recognize these things within your own experience, because that is the territory where we need to work, where the practice really happens, not just getting the intellectual understanding, but seeing it directly in our moment by moment experience. I'll just take some water and prepare yourselves, settle yourselves for some time of meditation. You might want to stretch a little bit and then settle into a comfortable posture. Okay, so I'll scoop in, obviously, the 4 foundations of mindfulness and then a focus on the hindrances within this practice. So by turning now, bringing our attention to the body, we begin to establish mindfulness of body. So not based on an idea, but just bringing your awareness to whatever sensations you feel in the body at this point in time. To start with whatever appears most obvious to you. So the sensations of pressure felt where you're sitting, the pressure of the body sitting on the cushion, the chair. As you're bringing your mindfulness, awareness to that, you're opening the mind to receive these impressions we call sensations, physical sensations. And what's that sense of pressure made up of? There's a sense of resistance, kind of a hardness of contact, resistance between the body and the cushion. It's a quality of heat where these two objects meet. There's the changing sensations, a bit like pins and needles, or the flow of blood or lymph through the tissues and muscles. You can also be aware of any other physical sensations that appear obvious. There may be particular places in the body that feel more tight or feel more painful in one form or other. And we can observe those sensations as changing sensations. Once we start to direct mindfulness to those perceptions of pain or sensation, we see that it's not actually one thing. It's a whole cascade of different momentary sensations. And we can continue to observe that with mindfulness, awareness. We can be aware of the shape the body is in, the posture. Aware of the points of contact where our limbs overlap or rest on each other. And aware of any of the sensations connected with the in and out breath. Because the body breathes very naturally, automatically. We feel the breath moving in and out of the body, and we can observe and follow the cascade of sensations of the movement of the breath. So at this stage, as we're establishing mindfulness of body, this is recommended as a stage for, or as a practice that introduces calm to the body, or allows the body to calm and the mind to calm a little along with it. Just as we direct our attention and establish mindful awareness of particular experiences, we can notice some measure of this calm or relaxation taking place. And you can also notice at this point the restlessness of the mind. For some, it may be more pronounced than others, particularly if you're not used to meditation or are new to meditation and not used to establishing mindfulness on particular experiences. You might just notice that attention is flitting everywhere and that it seems hard to let attention rest anywhere for very long. So you can just notice this as mental restlessness. We can be mindful of this movement of mind as restlessness and know that it feels like this. And we notice that shift in perspective when we're mindful of restlessness as an experience. It has a different quality than just being moved by restlessness or lost in restlessness. Now we know it as a discrete experience of mind. And that knowing has within it a degree of mindfulness, samadhi, and wisdom. Now if we learn to recognize our breath, the sensation of breath, as a counterpoint to mental restlessness, because the breath is always there to be recognized. Now we're helping to ground that restless mental energy in a more calming perception. The sensation of the breath. Or indeed any sensation you feel in the body can help to calm that restless energy. Just know restlessness as restlessness, mental movement, habitual. And pick up on the sensation of the breath or the sensations of sitting to start to ground mindfulness in the present, weaning our attention off the habitual mental movement. Now, as we ground our attention, establish mindfulness in the body to some degree or other, we can notice the feeling tones associated with calming. Slightly more pleasant or much more pleasant. The feeling of relaxation is essentially more pleasant than the feeling of agitated mental movement. So we just notice that. Notice where this feeling is felt. Is it the body or the mind or both? And if we get drawn into the restless agitation, for the sake of this contemplation, just notice the feeling tone of that. Is it pleasant or unpleasant? And all the while, as we're noticing feeling tone with whatever's present, we can continue to use the breath as a stabilizing reference. The momentary sensation of breath as it moves in and out of the body. So whatever you're experiencing right now, just notice the overall environment of the mind. Is there any desire present or not? Is the mind affected by lust or desire in some form or not? Is the mind affected in any way by hatred at this point? Any agitation or ill will or aversion present or not? Just notice how it is, neither judging or preferencing, but just knowing how it is in this moment. Do you notice if the mind is affected by any confusion or delusion? Is it caught up in I making, mine making, me making? Is it confused and caught in confusion or not? Is it just open, aware? We can also notice or learn to notice if a doubt arises, such as, oh, I'm really not sure if I'm doing the right thing. I'm totally lost. Just to be able to recognize, uncertainty, doubt has entered the mind. It feels like this. Or similarly, is there worry? A worrying thought about the past or the future. It always arises with a thought or sometimes just a background grinding of worry, a kind of a gnawing sensation of angst. Just notice, is that something that's present or not? How does it feel if it's present? Can you know it as a state that has arisen? It can be known, observed, and let go of in this moment. Not clung to, not identified with, just seeing as a mind state. Or similarly with dullness or tiredness, just to notice, is the mind affected by dullness or tiredness right now? Or not? Just to know it as it is. Get to know it as a particular state that comes and goes. Not me, not mine, not what I am. So bringing your awareness more strongly to the breath now and the body as we draw this meditation to a close. Take a couple of deep, conscious in-breaths and out-breaths. And in your own time, come back into the shared space of this live stream and into the, if you'd like to ask any questions, into the chat room. Thank you for joining me in this meditation. So, if there's any questions coming up, I'm very happy to respond to them. So the first question that's come up from Christy, she says, can you tell us about any samadhi or awakening experiences you have had? Traditionally, from the monastic side of things, usually we don't go talking about those things publicly, because, I mean, we teach about these things, about the Buddha's, the way the Buddha taught, and we teach obviously from our own insight and understanding to whatever degree that has developed. But generally, we don't go talking about any particular details of awakening experiences, because for many reasons, but within the tradition, it can lead to unfortunate, some people can overestimate what they've realized, what they've experienced. And in the early days, there's a Vinaya rule for monastics not to talk about these things publicly, because there's a story in the earlier days, some uncouth monastics saw that, if they were to claim certain attainments and insight, they would get a lot more support. And that's why the Buddha made a rule about not speaking about these things publicly. But we can speak to the degree that, teach how the Buddha's teaching is really verified. And, definitely, as the more you practice, these things are verified in your own experience, such as just what I talked about today in terms of insight arising from seeing these characteristics of our experience in our own hearts and minds of being impermanent, being changing, being not who and what I am. So even though that can register logically and intellectually, until you have a direct insight, it's not fully comprehended, and one doesn't taste the result of that insight, which is a degree of freedom. Freedom from identification and freedom from suffering in regards to that experience. So this insight into anicca travels all the way through, from the beginning of practice to the end of practice. And what I mean by the end of practice, and to clarify, I am not at the end of practice. I am still practicing. I am not fully awakened, I do declare. Now, that doesn't deny the fact that we're all, the Buddha nature and the truth of reality is here and now. But it's just saying I am still distracted at times, and caught up at times by certain things going on in the body-mind. And this is, next time in the Buddha-Dhamma series, I'm going to talk a bit more about the fetters, the 10 fetters, and the stages of awakening. So these paradigms go together. And it's a really profound paradigm in the early Buddhist teaching, and it's quite unique because it demonstrates what remains and what is cleared up in different stages and through the different insights along the path of awakening. So this isn't to say, because we're, I really enjoy the Dzogchen teachings and the Mahamudra teachings, the fact that they point directly, and also the non-dual teachings of Advaita and the non-dual teachings found within early Buddhism and the forest tradition particularly, pointing to the awareness which is already free. That is the truth of the situation. Awareness is already free. But the mind at times, if not, to lesser or greater degrees, is clouded by confusion, delusion, and so doesn't fully realize and fully manifest that reality. So this is what is in the process of being cleared up when we talk about practice. So we're not subscribing to this notion of I am somebody who has to do something in order to get somewhere else or something else that's in the future, because that doesn't accord with the way we practice the Dhamma, which is here and now. It doesn't accord with reality, which is manifesting here and now. The future does not exist. The past, in the same sense, does not exist. What's manifesting here and now is just this. We can remember the past. We can project about the future, have ideas about the future, but neither of those exist right now in that sense of what's manifesting. We can say that what's here is a result of the past, and what's here may be a cause for the so-called future. We can say that, but there's another way that we can look into these manifesting experiences and not label them past, present, future, which is ultimately a very freeing kind of way of being. So in terms of my own experience, it comes out within my teaching. I can verify that the process of insight that the Buddha points to in terms of developing mindfulness, insight into anicca, dukkha, and anatta really works. All teachers will teach, usually, if they're not just teaching from an academic idea, and many teachers do, they're teaching from their own experience, it will be just that. They will be teaching a way that has worked for them and conveying things in a way that has worked for them. It may not relate to, not everyone may relate to that, but because also everyone's communication skills are somewhat different, different capacity in communication. But talking about these 5 hindrances, as I was in that meditation, we all experience the 5 hindrances, even up until, some of the hindrances aren't knocked out completely in the first few stages of awakening. Only the last stage of full awakening, arahantship, knocks out restlessness and conceit and even some forms of desire and doubt, because ignorance isn't fully destroyed until that last fetter is uprooted. But also, as one practices mindfulness, you get to taste how the enlightenment factors emerge, because mindfulness is at the basis of the emergence of the enlightenment factors. Once mindfulness, excuse me, is established to a certain potency, and with inquiry into Dhamma, that is the wisdom factor inquiring into, looking into what it's experiencing, particularly in terms of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the not-self nature, how things are coming and going all the time. As these two potent spiritual faculties work together, mindfulness and wisdom, Ajahn Mahabua called them Mahasati and Mahapanya, great mindfulness, great wisdom. They work together like cogs and give rise to the other enlightenment factors. So there's energy that comes upon mindfulness, investigation of Dhamma. There's enlightenment factor of energy, of joy, of tranquility, of samadhi. I think I've got them all. Sati, Dhamma, Vijaya, Virya, Pitti, Passaddhi, Samadhi, Upekkha, and equanimity. So these 7 factors of enlightenment grow out of the potentizing of mindfulness and investigation. And it's in many teachings, it's these 7 factors of enlightenment brought to fulfillment. In a way, it's another way of talking about these 5 spiritual faculties becoming 5 spiritual powers. They're like, one could say they're like the one analogy that comes to mind now. It's like getting on the highway and you're in 5th gear and the car is just rolling on its own momentum. You know, you've reached a certain momentum and these things are just, all the gears, they're just rolling themselves. Say you've got an electric motor and it's just rolling. And you can kind of think, well, I'm not driving, the car's doing it, you know, we're just here because we've built up a certain momentum and potency. So these 7 factors of enlightenment work like that, very powerful, and creating great clarity in the mind, or revealing great clarity, suppressing the hindrances, bringing the mind to equanimity where it's no longer moving. So that equanimity allows things to come to a deep stillness where the clarity emerges more. And if the wisdom factor is fully ripe, it penetrates to Nibbana, or the deathless element, for one or other of the paths and fruits to be realized. So that penetration of the deathless element is what signifies there's 4 stages of awakening. Each stage, there's a penetration to the deathless and a deeper penetration or a deeper realization or recognition, whether one is able to stay within that for a certain period of time or just dip in. But that dipping or emergence into that is what destroys various of the fetters, kind of cuts off that level of delusion or confusion or reactivity. So stick with the series, obviously, and I'll talk more about the fetters and the stages of awakening next week as it relates to the early Buddhist paradigms. So a lot of questions have come in. Let me just go back. Can boredom be the same as the hindrance of dullness? It can be. Yeah, it can be, Kimberly. I find boredom has a particular flavor. Dullness can be just a sense of, you know, if the body's tired and the mind's tired, it just, rather than resting, the mind resting in a way that allows some clarity to emerge, it kind of just, it's like a blunt edge, or even a fogginess descends. There's a lack of energy in that. And sometimes bringing inquiry to it, the inquiry just to know, this is dullness or tiredness. What does it feel like? How does it come to be? That amount of inquiry actually brings in the energy, which can start to dispel the dullness. Subtle energy of interest and inquiry. Often dullness is like you just don't want to be involved in anything. But as soon as that interest, this is a mind state. If you're interested in Dhamma, if you're interested in liberation, you can get interested in these states. So when boredom arises, so you could have an inquiry, what's the difference between dullness and boredom? So you're asking the question because it's meaningful to you. So you experience boredom, you experience dullness. So recognize when that experience is there, what you call boredom. And just, this is the experience of boredom. Now you've got some mindfulness and some spacious awareness around it. What is the experience of boredom? Where do you feel it? Is it felt in the body? Is it felt in the mind? Or both? What's the characteristic of boredom? So just this inquiry, if you're interested, actually starts to change the nature of dhammas or boredom. So for me, boredom can be a little bit of a mixture. It can sometimes actually be, well, I realize at some point, it's like a suppressed restlessness. There's nothing to be interested in. I'm really bored, and sometimes getting stuck there. It's a suppressed energy. And then you might be looking for something to do, and it might morph into restlessness. What can I find that's interesting? Or you can just inquire into that state and how it changes. For each of us, we might feel it somewhat differently. So, the encouragement to inquire into that for yourself. The difference between boredom and dullness. And how long does it last? Once you know it for what it is, how long does it last? So someone says, can we talk about auspicious synchronicity? So maybe you can let me know a bit more about what you mean. Synchronicity, I understand. Things sometimes happen in auspicious ways, synchronistic ways. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly why. We sometimes call it serendipity or synchronicity. There's definitely a karmic component to that. Why things line up in a certain way, why things appear in a certain way at a certain time, the karmic component. And that just doesn't mean results of past karma. It can be the result of fairly recent karma, of setting your intention. You can set your intention. May the path become clear. May I find a local practicing Sangha group who I can connect with. Setting one's intention like this, or being open to, may I be open to receive guidance from the wisdom of the universe. These kind of things can open the mind to allow certain things to line up. Because often we're just caught in a very habitual, cyclic way of behaving in our routine, habitual habitats. And in this way, the mind isn't very open to new things or possibilities. And sometimes we just get caught in bemoaning what doesn't appear to be happening that we want to happen, rather than just actually saying, wow, I'd really like to be open to this happening. And this is the quality of faith, actually. When I spoke about that spiritual faculty of faith, the Pali word is saddha. It can get translated as faith, confidence, or trust. And I've come to see this in a more modern word as openness, to let the mind be open, receptive. It engages that quality of faith, trust, and a degree of confidence that you can allow the mind to be open, receptive. So this is like the beginning, opening your mind to the possibility of a spiritual path, the possibility of full liberation is the first step to allowing things to come, to inspire that path or that particular direction. Openness, when we truly allow the mind to be open, energy also comes, interest comes. Second spiritual faculty. Mindfulness comes. With mindfulness, samadhi, a deepening ability for the mind to gather, to recollect its energy around certain factors and things, and then the ripening of wisdom. So that's all I say about that for now. Many thanks for the wonderful teaching and meditation. Oh, bye, Marion. Must go to bed. Great. Great. People enjoyed the sit. The mind moves so quickly that sometimes I just need to slow the mind down in order to observe it more clearly. Thought moment, thought moment, thought moment. Exactly. And then these foundations of mindfulness are working to slow the mind down. So it's giving a particular domain wherein you want to focus your attention. So, as I say, bring your attention to the body. It's the first domain of practice to bring some calm to body and mind. Focus or settle your attention around one aspect of that bodily experience allows a deepening, calm, a slowing down. When we bring attention and mindfulness to the body, it generally slows the mind down. And that's exactly where you can observe more clearly. So that's good, Kimberly. During the meditation, the mind went very calm. The words seemed to be far away, but they were clear. But at the same time, a very calm feeling took over and felt like I was sinking more and more into it. Well, that's wonderful, Alex. But then you go on to say, is that sleepiness or dullness? No, the calm feeling is not sleepiness or dullness, but it can shift into sleepiness or dullness, particularly if you're not familiar with this calm, this meditative calm called tranquility or samatha. If we haven't yet developed or fairly new to meditative practice, the body mind, when it starts to experience calm like this, it can, out of habit, just think, oh, nothing's going on, it's time to go to sleep. And that's, that's because the body and mind is not yet familiar with this state, and it's a desirable state to get to sleep. And sleep is quite attractive, especially if your body is tired. And for many of us, our body and our mind is tired. But if you start to discern this calm feeling as just the natural calming of the body and the mind, and discern that, be aware of it as it is, and recognize the feeling tone of it, its pleasantness. It has a pleasant feeling tone. And to deepen this quality of samatha, of calm, just allow it through your mindfulness of it to spread through the whole body and mind. Let your whole body mind relax with it. And stay focused. If it's the awareness of the breath that has helped you come to this place, if that's your primary object of attention or the body as a whole, stay with that. Sometimes it's best the breath is a very useful grounding experience for the development of meditation, because as you experience more calm, the breath will slow. And as you pay attention to that slowing breath and notice the pleasant feeling, it can calm things even more. So to stay with discerning the breath keeps enough energy, enough interest for the mind to stay aware and bright and not necessarily drift into sleep or dullness. Now, at times you will find sleepiness or dullness will overtake the mind. But the more you practice to be aware of those influences when they enter, then the more energy you're bringing in to discern just what they are. And so it counteracts the sleepiness or the dullness effect. As meditators, we go in and out of these states quite often. And if the body's tired, sometimes you just can't emerge out of it. But sometimes you may rest. You might find the body-mind rests for a time in what we call, little cat nap or a moment of dipping. And then the natural awareness emerges again, and there's a sense of refreshment. And so that clarity can stay with. We can stay with that process of deepening meditation with the clarity. So this is all about just working it for yourself, exploring it for yourself, how sleepiness, dullness comes and go. But yes, that calm feeling, the samatha or the passaddhi, is a meditative calm. So they are different. The meditative calm is to be developed, and it's sustained with some degree of interest and energy and a deepening into samadhi. So Dylan asks, how to bring back concentration if you become dull or are subtly nodding off? So my response to Alex just now is addressing that. More interest, more inquiry. What is this state? Is this dullness? Look at what is this? Or come back to a more pronounced physical sensation of the breath. And sometimes if you're using the breath, take one big conscious in-breath and out-breath. So you get the system more oxygenated and you're establishing more that sense of the movement of the breath. I can still focus on the breath, but it alternates with the pleasant, sedating feeling of sleepiness. Yeah, so what I said with Alex, it can alternate. Just try to discern this is sleepiness, this is calm. If mind dips into sleep for a moment, the stronger you establish awareness or develop this quality of awareness and learning how to rest in awareness, that clarity will just emerge more and more. So even as your system may dip into a little sleep for a while, generally the clarity of that awareness will emerge. Someone says, can you tell us how or what motivated you to start this great YouTube channel? Well, that's Seminary 𝐿𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐻𝐼𝐻's channel. And you can read about that on the channel, on the About page, I think. She talks about what motivated her and those, all those kind of things. Someone says, looks like I'll need to listen to these podcasts again to get better value from them. They complement my first practice following ACIM. Don't quite know what ACIM is, but yes, generally is the more we do these meditations and listen to the Dhamma, even if we've heard it time and time again, they go in at a deeper level because we're at a different place in each time we're listening. And as insight, as wisdom clears up delusion, which can be a subtle process, not just sudden insight, it can be subtle, you find just naturally you understand things more and more deeply. So this is good. Do you find like there is a curriculum or basic stepping stones for one to ascend in the stages of awakening? Yes, you can read about these in the suttas, particularly if you read the sutta that I talked about this morning, Majjhima 10, Satipatthana Sutta, Foundations of Mindfulness, and the Anapanasati Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118, talking about mindfulness of breathing practice, which is somewhat what I used this morning and what I tend to use, using the breath to move through the stages of practice and insight. So, is all learning and benefits gained through the awareness we gain based on the attention assimilated through the basis of our experience? Is all the learning and benefits gained through awareness based on attention assimilated? Well, what I get from your question is you're saying, is all the learning and benefits based on the degree to which we can be aware of our experience? And I would say yes. The degree to which we can bring awareness, mindfulness, and wisdom to our experience, which is arising in the moment, changing in the moment. The Buddha's teachings are all about application of awareness, mindfulness, and wisdom to what's arising in this moment through the sense contact and this alternate paradigm of the five khandhas, this physical, mental field of experience. It's all within that. And that's what I'm trying to, the overriding arch of this series based in the Four Noble Truths and reinforcing particular trajectories within all of these many different teachings. It's actually a very simple trajectory. The practice is here and now. The practice is, and understanding, suffering and liberation is here and now, within, to be discerned within this field of bodily, mental experience. And to be discerned within this field, you need that, the spiritual qualities of mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, energy, openness. Adi says, I'm studying and practicing anapanasati following an early teachings teacher, but quite often it feels like I'm just making up experience to fit the frame of teachings. The 16 steps are tough, as opposed to following practice guidelines, for example, from Sam Harris or even Viveka Hermitage guided meditations. Well, Adi, that's kind of what I alluded to early in this session, that when we read the suttas, these are very old teachings, they're over 2,500 years old. They've been framed within an oral tradition, so they're formatted in a very formulaic and repetitive way in order that these remain coherent and contain within them all the details of the process of insight and the various ways to apply practice. So, and these teachings were first translated from oral records, and they had to create this script called Pali to capture this oral transmission, which was extant in various dialects. So they had to draw into one language they called Pali, written in the Sinhalese script, and then through the centuries, it's been translated in various languages into the English languages just in the last 200 to 300 years, or last 200 years. So, and now we have many different English translations of the same suttas, which is interesting. And from the early discourses, some comparative studies and how the Chinese corresponding discourses in the Chinese tradition, it's worded somewhat differently at times and sometimes very similarly. So you can see this process, the end product is very rich end product that can take a bit of unpacking. The language is unfamiliar to us. We need to go through a process of understanding, what do these Pali words mean? What do these paradigms mean in my language and in my experience? Because the original language of the Buddha, he was using the language that was extant in the day and relevant to the spiritual milieu, the spiritual practice milieu of the people he was teaching. So what they were hearing was very easily translatable. For us, not being culturally Buddhist and in fact being culturally often come through Judaic-Christian traditions, our language systems have developed differently, and our very different modern conditioning. So we've got this extra process of translation. We have to understand Buddhist concepts, Buddhist paradigms, Buddhist languaging, and what is it pointing to within my own experience. So whilst the discourses are incredibly rich, if you're not well practiced and well schooled in these paradigms and often the Pali language, it can feel quite abstract as we take on these ideas conceptually and try to develop conceptual mind maps for them. It can feel quite clunky. And so, as you're saying, I'm trying to, fit my experience into an existent frame. And you're saying it feels tough. The 16 steps seem tough. We could unpack that word, what you mean by tough. What the modern teachers are doing, like you're saying, following practice guidance, say from Sam or us or other modern teachers, we've gone through those translation processes so many times that now it's becoming easier for us to vocalize in our own language what this means. So in a sense, we can simplify the pointers. And so it comes to you, the end user, in a way that speaks more directly. I know what that means. I know what that means. I think in the Buddha's day, these teachings were probably the simple version for them, for those practitioners who were already, steeped in these models, the 5 khandhas, the ideas of concentration, insight. The Buddha certainly coined a few new terms and introduced different ways of viewing things, but for the most part, many people he was teaching to, he taught in a way that they understood directly what he was saying. And he used everyday language, speaking particularly to the lay audience. So we're trying to translate into everyday language what this means. But having said that, the 16 steps of Anapanasati, they can feel kind of opaque and abstract at first, but the more you develop it internally, the more your experience is like, that's what that means. That's what that means. Rather than trying to make our experience fit our conceptual translation of what's in the sutta. From the practice experiences, if you just allow the mindfulness, present moment awareness to deepen, and using your own wisdom factor to recognize what's present, how it comes and goes, that'll deepen by itself. And then that clarity of, that's what it means. It wasn't so opaque after all. But when we're coming at it intellectually, it appears much more opaque. So it takes time. It takes time to embody this practice. But but it's certainly been a passion of mine to try and find a language that speaks more directly to the modern mind and cuts through some of the obfuscating factors of the more ancient language and presentation. There's a few comments here. Can you speak about the feeling of shame and how to deal with it whenever it arises? Yeah, so the feeling of shame, in my experience, I came to see that particular feeling in terms of emotions on the scale of things that can be felt and emotional states, mind states. Shame is one of the hardest to feel. It's and it's one that many of us actually experience. It doesn't have to necessarily arise from say traumatic or early abuse experiences, although it will if there is that. But often in our society as youngsters, we are culturally conditioned and brought up in ways where feelings of shame are used to teach us what is right and wrong, and therefore what is good and bad. Are you a good girl or a bad girl? You're a bad girl for doing this, or a bad boy for doing that. A good girl for doing this, or a good boy for doing that. Often the way of parenting, at least in my generation and previous generations, we've been, in some ways, that feeling of we have been shamed in some ways, not necessarily intentionally by the parents or teachers, but just because that was the cultural way of teaching kids what's good and bad, right and wrong, moral ways of being in the world. So there's tremendous benefit to be taught and to recognize moral, wholesome ways of being in the world and being in relationship. But our early experiences and cultural experiences can sometimes have this shame at its basis. And so to become aware of it is really good, because it is a very painful experience and we tend to bury it. Psychologically, we can bury the feelings of shame, and then our actions and ways of being can become a bit distorted and a bit kind of out of balance, or we cannot feel a certain sense of authenticity until we've really allowed these feelings into full consciousness and seen through them, let them go, greet them with compassion. They're not who and what we are, so important to see, but they're results of certain conditioning. So I often say this, but just to say again, if you haven't found them, Kathy, my series of meditations on our website, vivekahermitage.com, called Embodying Awareness and Kindness, can address some of this more deeper, difficult emotional stuff to become conscious of and to move through and beyond. And shame, of course, is closely related to feelings of guilt too, and which is similarly culturally conditioned and deeply embedded. So Kimberly says, my mind can swing back and forth between boredom and restlessness. I find it does that often. Right. Thank you for bringing that up in the discussion of boredom. Yeah, well, this is a common experience, Kimberly, in meditation. So stick with it. As I say, to become interested in these mind states as momentary mind states, which have previously taken hold because we're unaware of them as mind states. So to bring awareness to them and interest in terms of investigation can result in some big shifts in your practice. So, in regards to that earlier question, what I'm calling auspicious synchronicity was that I painted a fox, and then every night since I've been visited by a fox in my yard. Before this, I've only seen a fox twice in my life. Oh, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, look, this is also, I think, to do a little bit with what they call the primal brain. When we create images, the primal brain communicates in images. And it's somehow related to the dream images as well, as the brain processes our life's experience in sleep through dreams. It communicates more in images. And sometimes this is brought out in different ways in modern practices. But if we hold an image in mind, it's making it more conscious. And then somehow we notice that thing within our field of experience much more easily. But in your case, it's kind of invited the fox to come in a way, or just been open to that connection. So this is also revealing some of the great mystery of the universe and the way things work. We really don't know, but it's really quite marvelous and wonderful. But be careful when the mind produces images, like particularly the things we don't want to happen, right? When we're fearful of something, we might think of what we really don't want to happen, what we want to avoid. But the primal mind just picks up on the image, not necessarily whether you want it or don't want it. So sometimes it's interesting to see how being frightened of something can help it actually assist in the manifestation of it rather than the avoidance of it. That's why it's often said not to dwell on such things. Anyway, just a thought to share. Great. Kirk says, I sat with some doubt. Thank you. Please may you define Dhamma again. Is it an object to also let go of? Dhamma is one of the terms which has a very broad spectrum, and its meaning depends on the context. So Dhamma, translation of the word Dhamma, can be, depending on the context, it can mean perhaps most directly the way things are, or reality, or truth. So you can see how they're all connected. Truth, the way things are, reality. And this is often in regards to seeing the way things are, the truth of things, the kind of penetrating insight, direct seeing, which is liberating. And then Dharma is also used for phenomena. Just Dharmas like a small d. Dharmas are like phenomena. So one of its translations is phenomena or things. And this isn't disconnected from those first meanings of the way things are, truth of the way things are, truth. They're phenomena too. So Dharma can also refer to the teaching of the Buddha, the Buddha's Dharma or Buddha-Dhamma, teaching of the Buddha, which isn't disconnected either, because his teaching, as he often said, is just pointing to the way things are, investigating experience, looking at phenomena to understand their appearance and disappearance, their impact. When we get stuck with them, fixated on them, and when there's liberation from them. Yeah. So in this respect, that fourth foundation of mindfulness being the contemplation of Dhamma, it kind of works across all of those meanings. It's the Dhamma of the Buddha that he teaches, the hindrances, the sense bases, the khandhas, the factors of enlightenment, Four Noble Truths. But they're also things in reality. They're phenomena in reality that can be seen and known directly for oneself. And the Buddha just presents them in these particular paradigms and ways to make it easier for us to direct our attention to the experience when it arises in order to understand them, to understand this phenomena, conditioned phenomena, and ultimately the unconditioned reality, which is not a phenomena, not a thing, but the basis of reality. It cannot be described with words because words create thingness in its dualistic constructs, the language constructs. So I hope that helps, Kirk. Could you define mind, please? What is it made of? Where is it located? Because I can't find it. Exactly. It can't be found, and yet there is mind. So you stumbled, Oliver, into a great insight. It can't be found. There is no thing necessarily that we can call mind. Every time you go to look, it's changing. It can't be found. But let me say the word mind is again a little bit of an umbrella term in the Buddha's teaching. Mind is an English word. In the Buddha's teaching, we have 3 words: mano, vijnana, citta. Mano is often translated as mind, but it means mind as in the sense base, mind for mentality, for the perception of mental movement, mentality, often related to intellectual faculty, the intellect, the faculty of intellect. So it's all mental stuff. Vijnana often gets translated as consciousness. I translate it as sense consciousness because it's always to do with the 6th sense consciousness. So eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, smell consciousness, touch, taste, and mind consciousness. Vijnana as consciousness or sense consciousness. We're encouraged to observe and to discern, to know it as it arises and ceases at the 6 sense points of contact. With sense contact, there is seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking or knowing at the mind, the sense door of the mind. Consciousness, sense consciousness arises and ceases. It can be discerned, it can be known. And then there's the word citta. And in many different translations, citta sometimes gets called mind, sometimes heart mind, and perhaps more recently, and what I lean to as well, is awareness, that basic awareness. Can we say that awareness is different from vijnana, is different from mano? In some respects, yes. In other respects, no. So when we use mind, it can refer to any of that as a general sense. Mentality, mental movement, the activity of sense consciousness, the quality of awareness itself. And different traditions will use these terms in different ways. So it can be confusing for the novice trying to navigate this. But once you understand the nuances and particularly have recognized the way these manifest, arise and cease, appear, the basis of awareness itself within one's own experience, you become much clearer. And then the Zen tradition might talk about big mind as opposed to small mind, or just mind covering all of this activity. But in essence, its essence is awareness itself. So, let me see. What is sympathetic joyousness? Well, that's one of the 4 Brahma Viharas, or the 4 boundless qualities called mudita. And these are talked about together. Kindness is metta, compassion, karuna, joy, mudita, and equanimity is upekkha. These are the 4 expressions of the loving heart in relationship. 4 expressions, 4 faces of love in relationship. Sometimes I call them the emotional life of a Buddha. They rise in response in the relational field from a mind that's clear and open. But they're innate qualities of the heart to be realized, or expressions of the heart that is clear. But they can also be developed as qualities of mind. So different traditions relate to these things in ways that they can be developed and cultivated to bring them more to the fore, and also to counteract or used as counterweights to their opposites, such as hatred or envy or ill will or mental disturbance. Okay, that's good. Do Buddhists like yourself get married, or can they have a boyfriend or girlfriend? Monastics don't marry. Monastics are fully celibate. But any other Buddhist who is not celibate, of course, they can get married and have relationships. Absolutely. Are the 7 factors of enlightenment, 5 hindrances, 4 noble truths, 6 sense bases? So the Dhamma, the foundation of 4th foundation of mindfulness includes the 5 hindrances, the 5 khandhas, or the 5 aggregates of existence, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. And then, so that's just to clarify, Kimberly. The 4 foundations of mindfulness are a description of the practice of mindfulness. And in the 4th foundation, you'll find these 5 categories of dhammas to be understood. So look up the sutta online. It's called MN, is a shortening for Majjhima Nikaya, number 10. So MN 10, or Satipatthana Sutta, and you can read directly the sutta which clarifies all of those things. Okay, so we've gone for 2.5 hours already. There's a few questions left. I'm just going to quickly brush over and see what I need to bring out. So Jeremy's asking, how do you balance learning between becoming coldly academic, intellectual, and making it personal and fresh? Practice. It's just practice. Recognize when the mind is engaged in concepts, and develop your meditation practice is based on letting go, grounding yourself in presence, present time awareness, presence, recognizing what is, letting go with mindfulness and compassion. Yeah. And then your own insights in that process, you'll understand the academic presentation far more easily. But, initially we need to study in order even to begin practice, but then be aware of how much conceptualizing you bring into your practice, it doesn't help. So you've just got to trust the process of establishing mindfulness, calm and insight. Yeah, and inquire where you're getting stuck so as to release, let go, and trust the process. Great, okay. So a few comments on shame there. Yeah. So thanks again, everyone. Great. Well, I think we pretty much got through those questions. How do you stay in the essence? This is the last one. And does practice of silence lead to wisdom? Yes, practice of silence can lead to wisdom if it's not inner silence and awareness. There needs to be awareness, clarity of awareness. And how do you stay in the essence? It is a matter of the development of mindfulness and wisdom to practice. This is where practice comes in. We can all say just be present, calm the mind, but you need to recognize what it is that's disturbing the mind in order to let it go and relax into calm, into presence, which takes you into the essence. It's there. It's just obfuscated by our habitual restlessness. So this is what we work with. So thank you, everybody. We're going to have to leave it there for today. How to establish mindfulness daily? Exactly what I said. Take it from the sitting mat into your daily life. But there's plenty of information on our website to talk about that. And also to just bring attention to what you're doing as you're doing it. Notice a mind that keeps going to the past and future and let that go. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. And sorry if I missed your questions or didn't get to it, but I appreciate you staying with it. And next time, the next Buddha-Dhamma series will be the 5th. As I said, we'll talk about the fetters and the 4 stages of awakening. And the session that would otherwise have happened in 2 weeks' time is cancelled because we're going to be in retreat. So the next date for our live session will be in 4 weeks, and the date and links will be on our website. Thanks so much, everybody. Take good care. Be well. Be peaceful. Be kind to yourself. Best for now.